Hey guys, it's Mark, just with a random video about the psychology of ham radio. This one, that I can tell, has not been widely discussed, at least definitely in the ham radio community. But I think it's important. Reason being, the interest that you have, and a lot of this goes back to Jungian, Carl Jung psychology, his models, which have just been, they rocked the world and have been extremely useful in a lot of ways. They're not the end-all of psychology, but they've been extremely useful in our cultural renaissance during the 21st century and beyond into the 22nd. Here we are in the 22nd century, in the 20th century, moving into the 21st century. But a big part of that was the thing that you do that interests you reflects some need of your psychology. And ham radio has a lot of aspects to it. It's amazingly deep. And people always say this, amazingly broad and amazingly deep. So I wouldn't say ham radio has one psychology, one thing that it's urging you to do every time by doing it or by being interested in it. But it does call out to your interest through your kind of subconscious mind, like, wow, that sounds really cool. I'd love to be able to, tune in some distant station. So there's this receiving aspect, which in Jungian psychology we call perceptive or perception, where you're taking in information. And then you've got this other kind of more executive aspect, the frontal part of your brain, as opposed to the rear perceptive part of your brain, where you are kind of transmitting, I would say, is the best word to use for that. So broadly, you can define ham radio, split it up into those two characteristics of reception and transmission. And I would say loosely those relate to the kind of Jungian concepts of perception, taking in information, and then judgment, which is where you're basically creating things, being executive-minded, and kind of making things happen. You're organizing words at the very least when you're transmitting, and that requires an executive process in order for that to happen. Now, why would that be important to know about? What does this mean? Well, a lot of people, I'm a coach professionally. I own a coaching business, and I coach people who are, from a range of things. They're transitioning through a career, changing careers. They're starting businesses. They are running businesses. They are experiencing difficulties in relationships. They're starting new relationships, all kinds of different situations. And these interests are very, very useful to me and to my clients as something that we look into. And ham radio, one of the things it does is it tells you as an interest, if you're into the reception side of it, if you're more into listening, it tells you, hey, let's tune in to some of those really difficult, maybe those very elusive transmissions in life. Let's get at some of the messages that aren't immediately in your face in life. And what are some of those in your face messages in life that are really easy to tune in? I think some examples would be, to be happy, you need to have a big house, make a lot of money, smile a lot, put yourself out there, be really outgoing. There are some of those obvious messages that get repeated a lot that we start believing, right? But ham radio is more about tuning in those less often heard messages. Some of those messages and some of those signals might be extremely difficult. They might be time consuming to weed out, but they are very much, they speak to you at a level. By kind of tuning those in, you're also using these special gifts you have of perception, of finding the message that's meant for you, that is extremely important and that is relatable. And in coaching, a lot of what I do is help people weed out the general life message that they hear all the time or they read in books all the time. And they're not sure, it doesn't really, they'll try it, but it doesn't really work for them. To kind of separate that from the message that is just meant for them. And in our psychology, we have these methods of taking in that information. One of them is a very past-looking, past-reflective method where we kind of learn lessons from our past and listen to what we have learned from our past. What was that experience like for me? What did I learn about myself from that experience? Do you see how that's kind of tuning in a signal that's just meant for you? It might not be relatable to that other person, but that's just for you. That's really important. Another way is through our intuition. We might get sudden kind of random spikes or gut feelings or things like that that are very personal. And maybe we go into a party with a bunch of friends and something feels off to us, but it doesn't to everybody else. Have you ever experienced that? Sometimes that happens. And ham radio really gets at the source of, symbolically, metaphorically, the source of those, where there are some transmissions that are like that. And if you pay attention to them, you can tune them in, define them, understand them, translate them, and take action. So that's a really important part of our psychology that ham radio is reflecting while being this kind of interest. And our subconscious uses that as a tool to kind of try and get through to us. But I find it's helpful to explain this to help people so they can be even more aware and kind of get the jump on or get an advanced knowledge of these important signals before they get so important that your life starts to fall apart if you don't listen to them. Because at that point, you could easily say it's too late. It's going to take some time that you don't have, maybe. A big part of that is aging and approaching the end of your life. And I think that's why ham radio becomes an important symbol, an important interest, in other words, in people's lives when they're at mid-age. It is kind of a subconscious signal that, look, you're not going to live forever. And there are some important things that you need to tune in about life here that are just very personal for you. And maybe if you don't do that, if you don't act on that now, maybe you're not going to be able to live the life you wanted, or maybe life's not going to go the way that it could for you. So it can bring a lot of good into your life in that way. A big mistake I see people making is reaching for a reason to be interested in ham radio that is too sensory, too realistic, while simultaneously being too unrealistic. You'll see a lot of that in people that really emphasize and overemphasize things like preparedness for disasters. Okay, sure, disasters happen. It's good to be prepared. But there's this reasonable line of preparation, and then there's this kind of like, whoa, I'm over-prepared to the point that my wife is upset at me for how much closet space my stuff takes up, or heck, just room space in the house. Or my husband is annoyed at how much radio junk I leave around the house, or my mom is totally enraged at me because I used all my birthday money to buy this ham radio. Meanwhile, my clothes are shabby and stinky, or who knows what it could be, right? Everybody's different. But that's an important thing to keep in mind, is that the reason for an interest is quite often starts in that subconscious zone, and it bubbles up through the conscious, and we start to justify it with all these reasons. But that's not really necessary. You don't have to do that. And in fact, a lot of times that can keep you from a more qualitatively appropriate analysis of what that interest means to you. The transmission side, very, very important. That can mean you have some messages that people in your life that you haven't met yet even need to hear, and that you need to make some connections with people who think like you do, or who can metabolize the kind of information that you've been able to learn in your life and that you can share. Really important. So I hear people in ham radio, their psychology is really obvious, because they'll go, why are you listening so much, man? You need to key up and transmit. That's a huge part of this hobby. Well, that's reflecting their psychology, that they have this need to get a message out, to take that executive form of action and to really communicate. So I think that's really important to know as someone going into ham radio, that, if somebody is really up in your face about, gosh, reception is where it's at, or gosh, transmission is where it's at, just kind of contextualize that and understand that your psychology is different from theirs. And unless you share a lot of their past experiences and things, there's a good chance that what the hobby means to you could be completely different. Now, those are just two broad models: perception and judgment, and reception and transmission. Two broad separations. We can divide up and slice and dice ham radio into so many different ways that are really cool. But I wanted to share that because I think it's really important, so you don't end up maybe as a client of someone like me with this emergency on your hands, or an intervention by your family. It's important to take a stock of what the hobby means to you, metaphorically and symbolically, and maybe there is some signal I need to tune into. Maybe I need to get feedback and listen to people who have given me feedback in my life to whom I haven't paid much attention yet. So you never know what it is, but that's been really, really helpful for me in helping other people kind of work through and break through to the next level in their lives is to analyze these interests in terms of what their gifts are, some important life messages that come through those gifts, and how they can apply those kind of moving forward in their lives for an even more successful and happier outcome. To where you're excited about life, you're more interested, and you're less in this mode where you need to be just like everybody else. All right, guys, that's it for now on Ham Radio Psychology. Hope you enjoyed the video. Take care.